Hello everyone. This is the final lecture for Unit 1, and here I actually want to spin the coin a little bit and give actually an account with problems that are inherently tied with the concept of human rights. As we have seen from the previous lectures, the focus was more kind of on positive theoretical aspects, on this kind of normative value that human rights have. We have seen that they consist of this set of rights and norms that are actually put in place in order to regulate the interaction between the individuals and regulate the action of governments towards their own citizens and citizens of other countries. Now, although the theoretical aspects in itself have been subsequently further developed, made more complex and so on, the initial premise is still the same, that is that these set of rights are universal, that they are inalienable from the people, and that in itself everyone has obligations to protect them. Now, this lecture will show us what kind of pitfalls, what kind of difficulties are tied with this understanding. Let's start with the first part. Human rights claims, too much or too little. What does it mean to have inalienable rights as a human being? We have seen that UN Declaration on Human Rights puts forward a set of norms and goals, but despite these kind of very humanist endeavors, the basic question is, are those norms and goals actually realizable? What is necessary in order to have these rights protected? Why are these entitlements so easily violated and ignored despite all the international attention and focus? In order to address these questions, I will start with a very short piece of Hannah Arendt, where she basically tries to identify the basic deficiency of this kind of concept of human rights. So, in Arendt's view on human rights builds on this political understanding of what it means to be human. The traditional view on human rights tend to regard its subject as the people, that is, the people of the national state, as someone who belongs to a specific cultural, political, and ethnic framework. As you can see, like around this time, and we are talking about 1948 and 1949, where the declaration was made and put into reality, the states were more or less still very ethnically uniform. That means that there was not a lot of immigration. US was actually one of the rare examples when this kind of norm was not actually applying to, but in Europe, you still have a very consistent account of ethnic consistency within these countries. Just later, as an ongoing, as an effect of ongoing process of globalization, we have acquired this kind of migration between people. So you have immigrants from kind of undeveloped countries coming into more developed countries to work, and suddenly you have this kind of clash of different cultures, and we come to this term of multiculturalism. But casting these things aside, what Arendt's starting position and is basically that these rights that we are talking about and identify as human rights depend on simple capacity of a specific state, a specific set of institutions to protect them and enforce them. So, when people after the First World War were made stateless, that means that many countries were actually changing. So, beside a fall of the huge monarchies, like for example Austro-Hungarian monarchy, that was actually empire and consisted of many different countries that now became independent. By becoming stateless, they also lost their rights and their place in the world. When deprived of a place in the world, people also lose their space for action and speech. That means action and speech where they can be heard by someone. So, as you all know, how contemporary societies and nation states function is that you have this kind of institutional capacity to address the issues. So, for example, if you feel that your rights have been violated, you have easily and clearly identifiable institutions within the United States where you can go and make a claim for a redress or for reparation, and so on and so on. But in her opinion, that was not really the case in Europe back in that time. So, when people are deprived of a place in the world, people also lose their space for action and speech. They also lose access to this stage where they can appear. Where what she means by this appearance is that we are conceived as citizens and human beings only by other people. Literally, for us, being segregated, and now, like sitting in my office working on this lecture, I can basically unfold all these set of freedoms and rights that I have as a person, but that if there is no one else who will recognize them and help me protect them or enforce them as a set of obligations towards other people, these rights mean nothing. So, in this kind of situation, these people, they can show who they are. This means, as Arendt says, is to become completely rightless and be deprived of humanity. What she wants to put forward here is basically a claim that without a nation state, without belonging to a certain specific set of institutions, human rights are nothing. And these people are actually nothing because there is no other instance in the world that can actually help and protect them. Now, one simple answer to Hannah Arendt will be, well, we have United Nations. Well, she will answer a reply in return that United Nations is not an instance, it's basically a collection of these different states and countries, and each one of these countries have their own interests that they want to protect. So as you know, like United Nations functions on basis of veto. So there are like 5 countries that are like Great Britain, France, United States of America, China, and Russia that can actually determine every kind of resolution that is taking place in UN. So for example, if someone comes and says, well, what's going on in Syria is actually extremely unacceptable. I want that we have kind of this joint international declaration that we are condemning the Assad's regime and all these kind of pathological manifestations that have resulted out of it, like ISIS and so on. And in order to achieve protection of human rights of Syrian citizens, we will send forces that will actually clear this insurgency once and for all. So although like 95% of countries will actually approve this kind of declaration and this kind of treaty, if Russia or China says no, that kind of action will not have any kind of validity based on international law. We will leave this aside because this is not the main point of my lecture. I just wanted to point out something else, and that is that the main objection that Hannah Arendt raises against United Nations Human Rights Declaration concerns its rather conspicuous lack of reality, an abstract notion of human that is conceived as their target. What does it mean that these rights lack reality or suffer from lack of realism? Well, Arendt's claim attests to this. Although these rights have normative appeal, and they ought to bind actions of individuals and governments, their enforcement or obligatory force depends on capacity and willingness of institutions, governments in this example, to protect them. Let's take a basic historical example that actually motivated the development of human rights discourse, and that is what happens if a nation, like for example Nazi Germany, decides to take such rights away from the part of European population, like it happened to Jews, ignore these rights, violate these rights, and in the end annihilate the whole population of innocent people. Also, in addition, human rights in their theoretical form seem to target a very abstract understanding of what human is. That is, in order to sort of have this kind of universal aspect, one has to strip down every kind of contingent feature of human beings. So that means that human who is stripped of all these contingent aspects, nationality, religion, cultural outlooks, etc., becomes a very abstract unit. Doing this, human rights target lose its identity and binding material. Because unfortunately, we live in a world where not all people count the same, not all people have the same worth. And we will talk about these dynamics, how something appears valuable in throughout the second and the third unit, but for now, one has to address this kind of inequality that is persisting in today's political and moral horizon. So let's identify these main basic issues tied with human rights discourse. So all the idea of human rights invites and advances notions of universality and inalienability. Such a theoretical account faces many issues in its practical implementation. Some of the major challenges are lack of knowledge, lack of capacity, lack of the commitment, and gap in security network, also known as security risks. These difficulties tied to the implementation raise a set of other questions, namely, are human rights really universal? If they are inalienable, why are they so easily violated? Are ongoing challenges to human rights, that is, poverty and global inequalities, discrimination, armed conflict and violence, democracy deficits, or weak institutions, really weakness of the concept itself, or rather points out that the immaturity of international political community to take these norms seriously? Let's go back to these issues. So, when we look at the world today, we can identify many conflicts, especially in the countries that had suffered from colonial past, like in Africa, like in the Middle East, like in Asia, and so on and so on. One of the explanations why these human rights have been violated is that basically people don't have awareness of them, that they lack knowledge of this concept and what this concept actually implies with itself. The second aspect is lack of capacity. Some countries don't have capacity to deal with their own internal issues. So for example, look at Syria. In Syria you have these kind of very weird ménage de trois, where you have three different parties with their own different interests and their own different support fighting over this country. So you have the government and the Assad regime at one side, then on the other side you have rebels who are supported by most Western countries and NATO states, and on the third side you have this very pathological aspect of ISIS, the Islamic Republic. So all these three different groups of people in Syria are not in the control of the situations. None of these sides are actually capable of having an upper hand, and what's going on at this moment is that we have a complete chaos. What, of course, usually, as it is with the wars, has the direst impact on a civilian population and children. I have been in Istanbul recently doing a research on the refugees there, and there are like approximately 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey at the moment. Most of them are actually not registered. They don't live in UN-organized refugee camps. They are scattered all over these kind of metropolitan areas, and you have to take into account that Istanbul has 17 million people. That's like New York. So usually what happens with these people is that they don't have capacity to work, don't have access to healthcare, live in a very horrifying conditions without real access to clean water or like regular food. And what's worse, they encounter discrimination and segregation on a daily basis. This is evident if you just walk in Sultan Ahmed. That's the oldest part of Istanbul, where all these kind of historical sites with lots of tourists basically are staged for ignorance, because you can see like many of these children, Syrian children, relying on charity of tourists and the Turkish population. And one thing that I have encountered is, of course, that they just meet ignorance. Not aid, not support, but actually very often also hatred from these people. The C, lack of the commitment, is another problem that faces this kind of international community, especially if we take into account how humanitarian intervention function today. So as we will see from second part of this lecture, that there is this kind of very devious and very problematic selectivism in interventions. So as it seems, the Western countries that have actually capacity to intervene are usually guided by their own interests. So there's this kind of weighing process where basically we evaluate what kind of consequences will our intervention have for us and the country that we are actually intervening in. So when we talk about Rwanda in the second unit of this course, when we talk about Srebrenica, when we talk about every dire instance of atrocities and human rights violations, even Holocaust, we can see that there was a kind of a very difficult and non-digestible ignorance from the international community towards these conditions that actually resulted in this murder and suffering of people. The final case is actually tied with security networks, also known as security risks. And we sort of tend to limit access of people to our institutions. We have restrictions towards certain citizens. They cannot actually travel into the United States and so on. You're aware of a very complex and difficult issue of unregistered workers in the United States, especially in the southern regions, and what kind of racial and sexist biases surface in these kind of processes where these people are employed and kept in a very slave-like conditions. With this said, I would like to talk about another aspect, and this is more tied not as much to kind of theoretical notion of human rights, but rather to implementation of these rights. So, some of the challenges tied with human rights are also tied with Western selectivism, as I mentioned earlier, in addressing conditions that result in human deprivation. This further leads to the problem of power. That is, why are we intervening here and not there? So, for example, I lived in Serbia throughout 1999 when NATO intervened and bombed most of the country into oblivion due human rights violations in one of the Serbian former provinces called Kosovo. Although the intervention was justified, in my opinion, because there was a very strong moral appeal to support and protect people from very oppressive government, I also think that if we take that kind of norm as norm of international behavior, why then the human rights violation in Turkey, in Russia or China are not equally addressed? Why is there no humanitarian intervention there? Why is NATO not intervening there? So as you can see, this kind of power asymmetry between different countries is one of the aspects how this kind of whole discourse gets deviated and is basically delivered to, well, relatively strategic interests that are put forward by states who are actually aimed to intervene in instances where atrocities actually do occur. There's also a problem of construction of an image of victim and perpetrator that ignores complex historical and political events and decisions that have led to the formation of these kind of instances of atrocities. So let's consider this claim, and this few sentences is taken from Slavoj Žižek's piece called Human Rights and Its Discontents, and it's actually available on D2L. So, quote, "There are, however, a series of features which disturb this idyllic picture," and this idyllic picture that he's mentioning is actually respect for the law and human freedoms and so on, this kind of main narrative how we justified humanitarian intervention. The first thing that cannot be that cannot but arouse our suspicion is how, in later justification of the intervention, the reference to the violation of human rights was always accompanied by vague reference to strategic interest. So this is the old point of why exactly Yugoslavia? Why not Turkey? Why not now Russia, and so on? Here, of course, we enter the shady world of international capital and its strategic interests. What Žižek does in his piece is basically tries to disclose this hypocrisy of human rights discourse. He doesn't want to basically claim that human rights in itself are a failed concept, but he wants to point out how the implementation and enforcement of this discourse is plagued by these inequalities, selfishness, and pursuit of own national interest. So every time I encounter a friend who lost a member in Afghanistan or Iraq and who was member of US armed forces, I ask myself, okay, what are we actually doing there? Are we protecting the rights of these people? These people are actually killing us to some extent. Are we there for concrete moral reasons? Because living in slavery, living under such a very conservative and harsh conditions is, especially towards one part of the population that is actually female population, is unjust and immoral. Is that the main motivation? Are we there for fuel? Are we there for kind of other strategic interest that places US on the pedestal of military and economic power? I mean, if we really want to understand what's going on there, we need to start with ourselves. We need to start not so much with the manifestation of problems like, okay, there are evident human rights violations in these countries, but also we have to take into account, okay, what are interests that guide our government to actually be there, to risk life of American citizens, to risk life of native citizens there, because we often encounter what's going on with all these mistakes by drones and bomb attacks and so on and so on. So all this basically sort of points out that there's a huge gap between the theoretical account of human rights and its practical realization. So this is more a question for all of us than a claim that I want to make in this lecture, and that is, why is implementation of human rights failing? Is it because of selectivism? Is it a financial burden? Are the strategic interests what we actually prioritize in our conduct as a government? Is it racism? Is it sexism? Is there something else? So with all this said, I would like to have this task number 2 for you for our discussion forums for the week 2, or wherever you find it convenient, is that I want you to post on our discussion forums your own observation why implementation and protection of human rights is so difficult. This task wants you to focus on this gap between theoretical aspect of human rights and their practical manifestation and enforcement. So most of you did very good job in identifying what these rights are. You have a very good grasp what human rights are in their theoretical nature. You also basically rank these different freedoms and rights that we have. So now I want you to switch side and basically realize and think about it and make an observation why these set of rights are so hard to protect. Why is this human rights discourse, despite this huge international attention and focus, still failing to protect people in need? Because one major aspect is that going back to Hannah Arendt's piece, is that the human rights are basically this last aspect of protection of human beings. Because as citizens of specific countries, we have institutions that basically protect our rights. So for example, if you drive with a bike to the MSU campus and somebody steals your bike, you have actual institutions where you can refer to in order to protect your rights, protect your property. You go to police, you report that your bike is stolen. Police does its own work and finds the perpetrator or not, or in any form you will have insurance that covers it and you will receive some kind of reparation there. But imagine this. Imagine if you live in a state that is failing, where institutions cannot actually protect citizens, like for example in Syria or even Iraq. You, as a human being, as a Syrian, then fall back on this very minimum, very basic notion of human rights, these rights that you have as a human being. But exactly in that moment where you're nothing more than a human being with all these rights and freedoms that we identified, these freedoms don't mean much because there's no one else who will protect them. So my questions to you, my questions to myself in most cases is, how can we overcome this situation? Going back to the task itself, I want you to think about it. What do you see as major challenges for human rights? And try to support your posts and insights with readings that we have encountered in this unit. I hope this was helpful. I will start posting more on the discussion forum with kind of short observations regarding our readings, and I'm still kind of waiting to see discussion develop between you guys before I intervene. So thank you for your attention, and I hope that you are enjoying the content up to this point. Thank you.